Ava Carter had taken countless flights before. Airports, lounges, and the quiet hum of jet engines had become a familiar backdrop to her life. As a high-ranking executive, travel was just another part of the job, another meeting in another city, another late-night reviewing reports from a hotel room. But today felt different, though she couldn't quite explain why. Perhaps it was the crisp morning air as she stepped onto the jet bridge, or the way the sunlight streamed through the airport windows, casting long golden streaks across the terminal floor. She had no idea that within minutes of settling into her seat, she would be at the center of an incident that would shake the entire airline industry. Ava moved through the first-class cabin with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged, because she did. Dressed in a sleek tailored blazer over an elegant dress, she carried herself with an effortless grace. Her natural curls framed her face, and in one hand she held a leather laptop bag, worn but sturdy, a testament to years of hard work and dedication. In the other she gripped her first-class boarding pass. She had flown this airline dozens of times before, and this seat, this experience, was nothing new. She found her seat and placed her bag in the overhead compartment with ease, before settling into the plush first-class chair. The moment she fastened her seatbelt, she exhaled softly, preparing for the flight ahead. She reached into her bag, pulled out a sleek notebook, and began jotting down notes. Plans for an upcoming board meeting, reminders for the week ahead. She was so focused that she barely noticed the approaching flight attendant. "Excuse me, ma'am." Ava looked up, her pen hovering just above the paper. The woman standing before her was tall, with sharp features, and a name tag that read Miranda Scott. Her uniform was crisp, her posture rigid. "I need to see your boarding pass." Ava blinked, momentarily caught off guard. The request was abrupt, but she remained composed. She had flown first class enough times to know this wasn't standard procedure. She reached for her pass and handed it over. "Of course." Miranda scanned the ticket, her frown deepening ever so slightly. "This must be a mistake." Ava's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" Miranda's polite tone had been replaced with something firmer, something that carried a weight Ava recognized all too well. "I'll have to ask you to move to the main cabin," Miranda continued. "There's been an issue with your booking." Ava straightened in her seat. "There's no mistake. I booked this ticket weeks ago and it was confirmed." Miranda pressed her lips into a tight line. "I've checked, and I don't believe. This seat is appropriate for you." The air between them grew thick. Ava knew exactly what was happening, but she wanted to hear it spoken out loud. She had spent her entire career breaking barriers, proving herself in boardrooms where she was often the only woman, the only black executive at the table. She knew the signs, the questioning glances, the unspoken disbelief when she walked into luxury spaces. But this was different. This was blatant. Ava inhaled slowly, keeping her voice even. "Are you implying that I don't belong in first class?" Miranda's expression didn't waver. "I don't have time to explain. Either you move, or I'll have to call security to assist." Ava held her gaze, her mind racing. She could challenge this. She could demand to speak to a supervisor, refuse to move, make a scene. But then what? Be forcibly removed, arrested for causing a disturbance? She had seen it happen before. So instead, she did something Miranda didn't expect. She smiled. With a quiet nod, she unclipped her seatbelt, stood and retrieved her bag. The hush that had settled over the first-class cabin was suffocating. Passengers exchanged glances, some curious, some uncomfortable, some avoiding eye contact altogether. As she walked down the aisle toward economy, she felt the weight of every gaze on her back, the judgment, the silent complicity. She reached her new seat, a cramped middle-row chair in the economy section. The contrast was stark. Gone was the spacious first-class comfort, replaced with the tight quarters of standard seating. She placed her bag under the seat in front of her, sat down, and exhaled. Then, with calm precision, she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and typed a single message. It was brief, direct. Ava had built her career on strategy, on knowing when to speak and when to move in silence. And this moment required silence. She pressed send at 7 minutes. That was all it would take. Back in first class, Miranda carried on as if nothing had happened. She moved through the cabin with an air of satisfaction, ensuring drinks were served, offering polite smiles to passengers. But something felt off. It wasn't just the way people whispered as she passed. It wasn't just the way the other flight attendants, particularly Clara, the younger, more empathetic one, glanced toward the economy section with unease. No, it was something else, a tension, a shift in the air. And then the in-flight phone rang. Miranda answered it briskly. "This is Miranda." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "This is the airline's executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding a first-class passenger. We need you to provide a detailed report upon landing. Effective immediately. Ensure all passengers are treated respectfully, and do not make further seating changes without proper justification." Miranda's grip on the phone tightened. Yes, of course." She hung up, her face pale. She turned toward the main cabin, her eyes landing on Ava, seated quietly, her expression unreadable. For the first time, Miranda felt something gnawing at her, unease. Ava, on the other hand, remained perfectly composed. She crossed her legs, glanced at her watch, and took a slow sip of water. She knew exactly what was coming. Miranda had made a mistake that couldn't be undone, because what Miranda had failed to realize was that she hadn't just forced a black woman out of a first-class seat. She had underestimated the wrong woman entirely. Ava Carter had built her life on quiet strength. She was not the type to raise her voice in anger or demand attention. Instead, she commanded respect through her actions, through the unwavering steadiness in her gaze and the calculated precision in her movements. She had spent years perfecting the art of composure, of knowing when to push forward and when to step back and let others underestimate her. But beneath her calm exterior was a force few could reckon with. A woman who had learned that true power did not come from how loudly one spoke, but from how deeply one's presence was felt. From a young age, Ava had been told she had to work. Twice as hard to be seen as half as good. She had heard it from teachers, from mentors, and most of all from her mother, who had instilled in her the belief that dignity was not given, it was taken. And Ava had taken hers. She had carved out a space for herself in rooms where she had not been invited, at tables where she was not expected, and in conversations where her voice had, at first, been dismissed. She had built an empire of influence without ever needing to announce herself. When she entered a room, people noticed, not because she demanded their attention, but because her confidence was undeniable. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way she listened more than she spoke, the way she allowed silence to stretch until others filled it with their own discomfort. She was always watching, always assessing, always 3 steps ahead. It was this quiet power that had made her a formidable force in the corporate world. She had risen through the ranks of the airline industry, not by demanding recognition, but by making herself indispensable. She knew the numbers, the policies, the loopholes. She understood what made companies thrive and what made them crumble. She had advised executives, reshaped policies, and made decisions that had saved the airline millions. And yet, despite her influence, there were still those who saw her first as a black woman, and only second as an executive. She had experienced it before, the skepticism, the second-guessing, the lingering stares that questioned her right to be where she was. She had felt it in boardrooms, in negotiations, in high-end hotels and luxury spaces, where people hesitated before assuming she belonged. But she had never let it shake her. If anything, it had only sharpened her resolve. So when Miranda Scott stood over her, telling her she did not belong in the first-class seat she had rightfully paid for, Ava recognized the moment for exactly what it was. It was not a misunderstanding, it was not a mistake. It was a test, a moment that would determine whether she allowed herself to be diminished or whether she turned the tables entirely. Ava did not argue. She did not plead her case or attempt to justify her presence. She did not raise her voice in protest or demand that the other passengers stand up for her. She had learned long ago that power was not in making noise, it was in making moves. So she moved, not because she accepted Miranda's authority, but because she knew something Miranda did not. She knew exactly who she was, and she knew exactly how this would end. As she gathered her belongings and walked toward the back of the plane, she did so with her head held high, her movements deliberate. She did not slouch, did not shrink, did not allow herself to appear small. Because she was not small. She was a force, and forces do not beg for space, they take it. Seated in economy, Ava did not fume or rage. She did not let anger consume her. Instead, she acted. With the quiet efficiency of someone who had been preparing for moments like this her entire life, she took out her phone and sent a message. It was not long. It did not need to be. She had built a network of influence that stretched far beyond the confines of this plane. One call, one email, one well-placed message, and the wheels would begin to turn. And they did. While Miranda carried on with her duties, convinced that she had put Ava in her place, she remained blissfully unaware that the balance of power had already shifted. Ava Carter was not the type of woman you dismissed lightly. She was the type of woman who smiled in the face of injustice, not because she accepted it, but because she had already planned its undoing, and undo it she would, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they did not belong, for every black traveler who had ever been side-eyed in a luxury space, for every professional who had worked twice as hard only to be questioned twice as much. She was not just fighting for a seat. She was fighting for the right to never have to fight for one again. And that was a battle Ava Carter intended to win. The tension in the cabin was almost imperceptible at first, a subtle shift in the air that only the most observant passengers might have noticed. A few glances exchanged, a hushed murmur here and there, the unspoken understanding that something had just happened, something unjust, something that didn't sit right. But for Ava Carter, seated stiffly in her new cramped space in the main cabin, the injustice was not just something felt, it was something lived. She had boarded this flight with quiet confidence, with the kind of poise that came from years of knowing her own worth. She had walked down the jet bridge with ease, her leather laptop bag in one hand, her boarding pass in the other, and had taken her first-class seat just as she was entitled to. There was no reason for her to expect anything out of the ordinary, and yet in the back of her mind, she always knew there was a chance that someone would see her and assume she was in the wrong place, that someone turned out to be Miranda Scott. Miranda had approached with that forced politeness, the kind that wasn't truly a question, but rather a demand in disguise. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" The words had been spoken in a measured tone, but Ava had recognized them for what they were: a challenge, a test. She had handed over the pass without hesitation, her steady gaze meeting Miranda's as the flight attendant scrutinized it. And then the frown. The deepening crease in Miranda's forehead as she tried to reconcile what she was seeing with what she believed to be true. Ava Carter. First class. A seat that was fully paid for, fully legitimate. Miranda had handed the pass back, but Ava had known in that moment that it wasn't over. She had seen the look too many times before, the one that questioned, that doubted, that refused. To believe that a woman like her, a black woman composed, refined, successful, belonged in a space of luxury. Minutes later, Miranda had returned. This time there was no pretense of politeness, only a thinly veiled assertion of control. "Miss Carter, could you step aside for a moment? I need to verify something." Ava had felt the eyes of the cabin on her, the weight of their curiosity, their judgment. But she had stood with quiet grace, taking her bag and following Miranda to the galley. It was there, away from the full gaze of the passengers, that the true insult had been delivered. "I don't think this seat is appropriate for you." Ava had felt the words land like a slap, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't about a seating mistake. It wasn't about a logistical error. It was about perception, about bias, about the deeply ingrained belief that some people simply did not belong in certain spaces. She had questioned Miranda, pressed her for a valid explanation, but none had been given. Instead, there had been the threat of security, the looming implication that if Ava did not comply, she would be removed forcefully. And so, with the same quiet power she had always carried, Ava had taken her things and walked toward the back of the plane. But as she settled into her new seat, her mind had been anything but quiet. She was not the kind of person who reacted impulsively, who lashed out in anger or demanded immediate retribution. No, Ava Carter was a strategist. She understood the power of timing, of leverage, of letting the right people see the wrongdoings unfold. So she had pulled out her phone, sent a message, and waited. Meanwhile, Miranda had carried on with her duties, satisfied that she had restored order. She had smiled at the other first-class passengers, pouring their drinks with practiced ease, moving through the cabin with the confidence of someone who believed they had won. What she hadn't realized, what she would only come to understand, too late, was that Ava Carter was not just another passenger. She was a woman with power, with influence, with the kind of reach that could shake the very foundation of the airline itself. Back in the main cabin, the discomfort of the surrounding passengers was tangible. Some looked at Ava with silent sympathy, others with avoidance, as if pretending not to see the injustice would absolve them of its weight. One man leaned in and whispered, "That flight attendant has been giving you a hard time, hasn't she?" Ava had merely smiled, a small, knowing expression. "It's nothing. I can't handle because she knew even then that this flight was about to become something much bigger than a mere act of discrimination. It was about to become a reckoning. And as Miranda continued her duties, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface, Ava remained still, composed, methodical, because the thing about quiet power is that it does not need to announce itself. It simply waits. And then, when the moment is right, it changes everything. Miranda Scott had always trusted her instincts. As a flight attendant, she had learned to read people quickly, to assess a situation within seconds. It was a skill that had served her well over the years, allowing her to handle unruly passengers, anticipate needs and maintain control of the cabin. But what she didn't realize, what she failed to see in that moment, was that her instincts had led her into a mistake she couldn't undo. She had looked at Ava Carter and made a decision, not based on logic, not based on fact, but based on something deeper, something unspoken yet insidious. Ava had looked out of place. She didn't fit the profile of what Miranda expected in first class, and so she had assumed, wrongly, recklessly, that there had been an error. Miranda had seen it as a simple correction, a minor adjustment, nothing more. But the moment she escorted Ava out of first class, the moment she forced her to gather her things and move to a lesser seat without justification, she set into motion a chain of events that would spiral beyond her control. At first, Miranda had felt a sense of satisfaction. She had done her job, upheld the order of things. The airline prided itself on excellence, on catering to a certain clientele, and to her, enforcing that standard was part of her responsibility. But there was something about Ava's demeanor that unsettled her. Ava had not reacted as most people would have. She had not raised her voice or caused a scene. She had not begged or argued. She had simply looked at Miranda, her expression unreadable, and then, without a word, she had complied. That quiet acceptance should have reassured Miranda, but instead it made her uneasy. It was the kind of calm that did not signal defeat, but something else entirely. And then there was the phone call. Miranda had caught a glimpse of Ava's fingers moving swiftly across her phone screen after she took her new seat. She hadn't thought much of it at first. Passengers sent messages all the time before takeoff, but then just minutes later the call had come through. The intercom in the galley buzzed, and Dennis, the senior flight attendant, answered. Miranda had been arranging drinks at the time, but she caught the subtle shift in Dennis's posture, the way his brows furrowed slightly as he listened. And then he turned, phone still pressed to his ear, and met Miranda's gaze. "It's for you," he said, his voice tinged with something Miranda couldn't quite place. "They're asking for you by name." Miranda's stomach twisted. She hesitated before taking the receiver, a creeping sense of unease spreading through her. "This is Miranda," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. The response was calm but firm. "This is the airline's executive office. We've received a direct complaint regarding a first-class passenger on your flight. We will require a detailed report upon landing. In the meantime, ensure that all passengers are treated with respect and refrain from making any further seating changes without proper cause." Miranda's grip on the phone tightened. "Yes, of course," she managed. "I will handle it appropriately." As she hung up, her hand trembled slightly. Dennis was still watching her. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," Miranda muttered, but even she knew that wasn't true. When she turned back toward the cabin, her eyes found Ava again. She was seated quietly in the main cabin, looking out the window as though she had all the time in the world. There was no smugness, no sign of triumph, just patience, and for the first time Miranda felt a flicker of real fear. She had assumed Ava was just another passenger, someone she could dismiss without consequence. But now, as the weight of that phone call settled over her, she realized something. She had underestimated the wrong person. Dennis moved beside her, lowering his voice. "You better hope this doesn't come back to bite you," he said, his tone unreadable. Miranda didn't respond, because deep down she already knew it was too late for that. Miranda Scott had always believed she understood power. As a flight attendant, she had seen privilege in its many forms: executives demanding last-minute upgrades, celebrities expecting special treatment, and frequent flyers who carried themselves as if the plane belonged to them. She had learned to navigate these dynamics, to smile through entitlement, to enforce policies while keeping the peace. She thought she knew where power lay, but on this flight she was learning an entirely different lesson. It began with the phone call. When the airline's executive office reached out mid-flight, Miranda had dismissed it as an overreaction. She had assumed that Ava Carter was merely another disgruntled passenger, someone who had enough persistence to file a complaint, but not enough influence to make it matter. She thought the issue would be contained, an apology, perhaps a travel voucher, and then everything would return to normal. She was wrong. The second call came directly from the captain. Miranda had barely managed to shake off her first wave of anxiety when Dennis, the senior flight attendant, handed her a folded note. "The captain wants to see you," he said. Miranda's pulse quickened. It was rare for the captain to intervene in cabin affairs mid-flight. Flight attendants were expected to handle customer service issues on their own. If the captain was getting involved, it meant something bigger was at play. As she stepped into the cockpit, the door sealing behind her, she found herself facing Captain Harris, a man known for his calm authority. He looked at her with an expression that was unreadable but firm. "Miranda," he said, his tone measured, "we've received another communication from the executive office." Miranda straightened, her posture. "Sir, The captain lifted a hand, silencing her. "The passenger you moved, Miss Ava Carter, is not just any passenger. She is connected to the airline's board of directors. We are under direct orders to ensure that she is treated with the utmost respect for the remainder of this flight." Miranda's stomach dropped. She had spent years enforcing the hierarchy of air travel, understanding which passengers carried weight and which ones could be ignored. But she had completely misjudged Ava Carter. I didn't know," she stammered, her throat dry. Captain Harris's gaze sharpened. "Did you think, or did you assume?" Miranda felt heat rise in her cheeks. There was no way to justify her decision now. No procedural excuse, no misunderstanding that would make this go away. She had made a snap judgment, one rooted in unconscious bias, and now it was unraveling in ways she couldn't control. "This is serious," the captain continued. "When we land, you will provide a full report. Until then, you are to ensure there are no further incidents. Do not approach Miss Carter unless absolutely necessary. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Miranda whispered. Dismissed. Miranda walked out of the cockpit, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. As she re-entered the cabin, her gaze instinctively sought out Ava. There she was, seated in the main cabin, poised and unbothered. If she had overheard any of the commotion, she gave no indication. She was simply sitting there watching the world pass by at 30,000 feet, her fingers lightly drumming against the armrest. Miranda, for the first time in her career, felt powerless. The shift was undeniable. She had walked onto this flight believing she was in control, that she could decide who belonged where. That, her word, her instincts were enough to determine the rules. But the world didn't work that way, not for everyone. Ava Carter had not needed to argue, to plead her case, to demand justice in the way Miranda had expected. She had not raised her voice or caused a disruption. Instead, she had made a call, a single call that had turned the tide entirely. That was power. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. It was quiet, strategic, precise, and it had left Miranda reeling. The realization sat heavily in her chest as she forced herself to return to her duties. She moved through the first-class cabin with a brittle smile, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee for a passenger. She spilled a few drops onto the tray and muttered a curse under her breath. Dennis, watching her closely, spoke in a low voice. "You really messed up this time." Miranda didn't respond. She didn't have to, because she knew. She had underestimated the wrong passenger, and now the consequences were unfolding faster than she could contain them. The consequences begin. Justice takes flight. Miranda Scott had never feared landing before. Every flight ended the same way. A routine descent, passengers gathering their belongings, and the crew preparing for the next journey. But this time, as the plane began its approach, she felt like she was plummeting toward an uncertain fate. The weight of what had unfolded over the past few hours pressed down on her like a crushing force. She had spent the remainder of the flight moving through the cabin with robotic precision, avoiding eye contact, forcing smiles that no longer felt natural. But she could not escape the truth. She had crossed a line, and now justice was coming, for her at 500 miles per hour. Ava Carter, on the other hand, sat with quiet anticipation. She had spent the last hour watching the clouds drift by, her mind calm and calculating. Everything was in motion now. She had made the necessary calls, sent the right messages, and ensured that those who needed to be aware of the situation were already taking action. She did not relish what was about to happen, not in the way someone vengeful might, but she did believe in accountability. This wasn't just about her. It was about setting a precedent, about making sure that people like Miranda Scott understood that unchecked bias had consequences. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright positions. On behalf of the entire crew, we thank you for flying with us today." Ava smiled faintly. The crew, Miranda Scott, was still a part of that crew. For now. Miranda could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she made final checks around the first-class cabin. She had convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, the worst of it was over. Perhaps the executives would handle this internally. Perhaps there would be a meeting, a reprimand, but nothing more. She had spent years with this airline. One mistake wouldn't be enough to ruin her career. Would it? But then she saw Ava move. Unlike the other passengers who eagerly unbuckled their seatbelts the moment the plane touched down, Ava remained seated. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and sent a single message. Then she looked up, locking eyes with Miranda for the briefest moment. Miranda's stomach twisted. The doors opened, passengers began filing out, their conversations blending into the hum of the airport terminal beyond. Miranda positioned herself near the exit, forcing a professional smile as she bid farewell to the travelers she had once felt so in control of. But her confidence had been shaken, her grip on her authority slipping with every step Ava Carter took toward the door, and then Ava stopped. For a moment she simply stood there, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice so even and composed it sent a shiver through Miranda's spine, she said, "I'm sure we'll be in touch." Then she was gone. Miranda exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. The terminal was right there, a familiar world just beyond her reach. She could walk off this plane, leave this flight behind, and pretend it had been just another day. But the illusion shattered the moment she spotted two uniformed security officers making their way toward the aircraft. Her heart stopped. "Passengers," whispered among themselves as the officers stepped onto the plane, scanning the cabin before their eyes landed on her. "Are you Miranda Scott?" one of them asked. Her mouth went dry. "Yes. We need you to come with us." She barely registered the murmurs around her as she was escorted off the plane. The walk through the terminal felt like a slow-motion nightmare. She could feel the stares of passengers who had witnessed everything unfold, their judgment hanging in the air like a storm cloud. She had been in control once. Now she was at the mercy of forces she had never even considered. They led her into a stark, windowless room. A single table, 2 chairs, a silence so heavy it pressed against her chest. She had never been on this side of an investigation before. She had always been the one enforcing the rules, not answering for breaking them. Minutes stretched into eternity before the door opened and 2 executives from the airline entered. They were dressed in sharp suits, their expressions unreadable. But Miranda knew, she could see it in their eyes. They weren't here to listen. They were here to make a decision. One of them, a woman with a composed but firm demeanor, slid a folder across the table. "Miss Scott, we've received a formal complaint regarding your conduct on Flight 287. We need to hear your account before we proceed further." Miranda's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were written statements from passengers, crew members, and most damning of all, Ava Carter. She swallowed hard. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The other executive, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Then explain to us why it did." Miranda searched for words for a justification that might save her. "I was just following protocol. I thought there had been a mistake with her ticket." The woman tilted her head slightly. "And did you verify that before removing her?" Miranda's silence answered the question. The man sighed, rubbing his temples. "Miss Carter is not only a valued customer, but a major shareholder in this airline. Her complaint has already reached the board of directors. Do you understand the gravity of this situation?" Miranda's throat tightened. She had never considered the weight of her actions before. She had made a judgment, a simple one, she had thought. But now, that judgment was unraveling her career. Before her eyes, the woman closed the folder. "We will be conducting a formal review. Until then, you are suspended from duty." Miranda opened her mouth, but no words came. Suspended. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. "We'll be in touch with our final decision," the man added. With that, they stood and left. Miranda sat there, staring at the folder in front of her. She had spent years believing she understood power, believing she knew how the world worked. But she had been wrong. She had underestimated the wrong passenger. And now, justice had taken flight. Beyond personal justice, changing the system, Ava Carter had never been one to seek revenge. Justice, yes, Change, absolutely. But revenge, that was never her goal. As she sat in her office days after the incident, the echoes of that humiliating flight still lingered in her mind. Not because she was dwelling on the personal slight, but because she knew her experience was not unique. She had resources, influence, and the ability to push for consequences, but what about those who didn't? How many others had been quietly dismissed, forced to endure indignities they shouldn't have faced? Her inbox was already filling with messages from the airline's executives. Apologies, promises, urgent requests to meet. But Ava knew that words alone meant nothing. It was easy to apologize after getting caught. The real question was whether they were willing to make meaningful changes. She wasn't interested in a public statement or a temporary suspension of one employee. She wanted something lasting, something that would ensure no one else had to experience what she did. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly as she stared out the window of her high-rise office. The city below was alive with movement, a reminder that while her world had shifted dramatically in the past few days, life for everyone else went on. But if she did this right, if she played her hand carefully, life wouldn't just continue, as it always had. It would be different, better. The first meeting came faster than she expected. Richard Hale, the airline's CEO, was a man accustomed to being in control, yet when he walked into the conference room where Ava was waiting, there was a stiffness to his movements, a slight hesitation in his normally confident demeanor. He knew what was at stake. "Ava," he greeted, offering a polite but careful handshake. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me." She nodded, gesturing toward the seat across from her. "Let's not waste time, Richard. You know why we're here." He sighed as he sat, adjusting his tie as though trying to steady himself. "First and foremost, I want to personally apologize for what happened. It was unacceptable. We take these matters very seriously." Ava raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" There was a beat of silence before he cleared his throat. "Yes, and that's why we're committed to making changes." She folded her hands together, watching him carefully. "What kind of changes?" Richard hesitated. He was used to being the one in control of these conversations, dictating the terms, steering the outcome. But Ava wasn't just another upset customer. She was a woman with power, and more importantly, she was a woman with a purpose. "We've suspended the flight attendant in question and will be conducting a full internal review of our diversity training programs," he began. "We're also considering updates to our policies to ensure that situations like this are handled more appropriately in the future." Ava remained unimpressed. "That's not enough." Richard's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained composed. "Then tell me what you believe is enough." She leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. "I want mandatory company-wide bias and sensitivity training. Not just for flight attendants, but for all employees, including executives. I want a complete review of your hiring and promotion practices to ensure diversity at every level of this company. I want a clear, enforceable policy that outlines exactly how situations like this should be handled, so that personal bias doesn't dictate professional decisions, and I want transparency. That means quarterly reports on the progress of these initiatives, with measurable goals." The CEO exhaled slowly, considering her demands. "You don't want just an apology. You want a restructuring." "I want accountability," Ava corrected, "because I guarantee you this isn't the first time something like this has happened. It's just the first time it's happened to the wrong person." He didn't argue. He knew she was right. There was a long silence as Richard steepled his fingers, thinking. Ava didn't rush him. She wanted him to feel the weight of this moment. Finally, he nodded. "I can't promise everything overnight," he admitted. "But I can promise movement in the right direction." Ava tilted her head slightly. "Then let's start moving." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and policy drafts. Ava wasn't naive. She knew corporate change didn't happen easily. It wasn't just about issuing new rules. It was about shifting an entire culture. There were those who pushed back, who believed she was asking for too much, that she was overreacting to a single incident. But Ava knew better. A single incident was never just a single incident. It was a symptom of something larger. Her push for transparency met resistance at first. The airline executives were hesitant to make internal diversity reports public, fearing backlash. But Ava held firm. If you're truly committed to change, you shouldn't be afraid of people seeing where you started. The airline eventually agreed. A public report would be issued quarterly, outlining hiring demographics, promotion statistics, and documented cases of bias complaints, including how they were handled. The implementation of bias training also proved to be a battle. Some employees saw it as unnecessary, an insult to their professionalism, but Ava had anticipated this. If your employees don't believe they need this training, then they're exactly the ones who need it the most, she argued. The board relented. Training was rolled out across all departments, starting from the top. As the months passed, Ava's fight began to show results. Hiring practices became more inclusive. Promotions were no longer decided by an unspoken culture of familiarity, but by merit and equity. Reports were reviewed and adjusted in real time, ensuring that the promises made were being kept. But perhaps the most telling shift came in the way employees, especially flight attendants, handled passengers. Where once there had been unchecked authority and subjective decision-making, there was now a conscious effort toward fairness. Incidents of discrimination, while not entirely eradicated, were now met with swift and clear consequences. The culture was changing, and people were noticing. One day, months after the flight that started it all, Ava found herself at the airport once again, preparing to board another plane. As she handed her ticket to the gate agent, she noticed something different. The staff carried themselves with a new awareness, a deliberate effort to treat every passenger with respect. She saw flight attendants assisting passengers without judgment, ensuring that each traveler felt valued. She smiled to herself. Progress. As she stepped onto the plane, she heard a familiar voice. "Miss Carter." She turned to find Clara, the young flight attendant who had shown her kindness that day. But this time Clara wasn't just another attendant. She wore a different uniform now, one that signified her promotion to a senior role. Ava's smile widened. "Clara, it's good to see you." Clara nodded, her expression filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you did. Things are different now, better." Ava nodded. That was the goal. She took her seat, gazing out at the tarmac as the plane prepared for takeoff. She knew the work wasn't over. There was still so much to do, so many industries beyond this one that needed the same level of accountability. But for now, she allowed herself to appreciate the victory. Change didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen easily. But it happened. Because people like her refused to accept the world as it was. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, and she wasn't done yet. Miranda's reckoning. Learning the hard way Miranda. Scott had spent years perfecting the art of control. As a flight attendant, she prided herself on her ability to command a cabin with poise, ensuring that every passenger adhered to the rules and expectations of the airline. She had worked hard to climb the ranks, enduring long flights, demanding passengers, and the unspoken but ever-present hierarchy that existed among airline staff. She knew how to handle difficult situations, how to de-escalate conflicts, and how to maintain order. But for all her experience, she had never anticipated this. The moment she stepped off the plane under the watchful eyes of airport security, Miranda felt the weight of what she had done. The murmurs from the remaining crew, the stares from passengers who had witnessed her fall from authority, it all pressed down on her like a crushing force. Just days ago, she had felt so certain, so justified in her actions. She had believed she was simply enforcing protocol, ensuring that order was maintained. But now, standing in a stark, windowless room inside the airport security office, she was forced to confront the truth. She had made a terrible mistake. The officers who questioned her were professional, but their tone was firm. They weren't treating her like a respected airline employee. They were treating her like a liability. She answered their questions, her voice tight, her palms damp with sweat. She explained her reasoning, tried to frame her actions as a misunderstanding. But every justification she gave only sounded weaker under the weight of the facts. Miss Carter had a valid first-class ticket. Miss Carter had broken no rules. Miss Carter had done nothing to warrant being removed from her seat. So why had Miranda decided she didn't belong there? The officers didn't need to say it outright. Miranda could hear the accusation in the silence that followed their questions. She swallowed hard, feeling her chest tighten with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before shame. She had told herself it was just a gut instinct. She had convinced herself that her actions were about maintaining order, ensuring the integrity of the first-class cabin. But as she sat in that room, stripped of the authority she once held so confidently, she realized that what she had done had nothing to do with airline policy and everything to do with an unconscious bias she had never questioned. By the time she was released, pending an official review by the airline's executive team, the gravity of the situation had fully set. Tennessee, the ride home was a blur. The moment she stepped into her small apartment, she collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling in silence. She had spent her entire career believing that she was fair, that she treated all passengers with the same level of professionalism. But the cold, hard truth was that she had looked at Ava Carter and made an assumption. And now, that assumption had cost her everything. The following morning, a formal email arrived from the airline's Human Resources Department. Miranda read it 3 times before the words fully registered. She was suspended indefinitely, pending a disciplinary hearing. She felt numb as she placed her phone down, her fingers trembling slightly. She had never been in this position before. She had always been the one enforcing rules, not the one being judged by them. The hearing was scheduled for the next day, and the hours leading up to it were agonizing. She hardly slept, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She had spent so many years building her career, sacrificing weekends, holidays, and personal time to prove her dedication. And now it was all unraveling because of one decision, one choice she couldn't take back. When she walked into the conference room at the airline's headquarters, she immediately knew there would be no easy way out of this. The 3 executives seated across from her wore unreadable expressions. their posture stiff and formal. A thick file sat in front of them, evidence of her actions, statements from passengers, and, no doubt, footage from the plane's security. Cameras. Miranda sat with her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding. One of the executives, a woman with sharp features and a piercing gaze, spoke first. "Miss Scott, we are here today to discuss the incident that took place on Flight 287. We have reviewed multiple accounts of the situation, including Miss Carter's complaint and statements from other passengers. Before we proceed, do you have anything you'd like to say?" Miranda opened her mouth, but for a long moment, no words came out. What could she possibly say? That she was sorry? That she had made a mistake? That she hadn't realized what she was doing in the moment? None of it would change the facts. Finally, she took a slow breath and spoke. "I made a poor judgment call. I should have verified Miss Carter's ticket properly before taking any action. I understand that now." The woman across from her tilted her head slightly, unimpressed. "Miss Carter presented her ticket to you. You verified it. You still asked her to move." Miranda swallowed. I can't explain why I felt something was wrong, but I understand that my actions were unacceptable." Another executive, a man with graying hair, leaned forward. "Miss Scott, let's be clear. You removed a paying first-class passenger without. Cause this is not just about poor judgment. This is about bias. Whether conscious or not, you saw a black woman in first class and assumed she didn't belong there." Miranda's stomach dropped. Hearing it put so plainly made it all the more real. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination," the man continued, "and given the severity of this incident, the board has made a decision." She felt like the air had been sucked from the room. She already knew what was coming before the words were spoken. "Effective immediately, your employment with the airline is terminated." There it was. Final, irreversible. She sat frozen, unable to process it at first. She had lost her job, her career, the thing she had poured years of her life into. The executives continued speaking, informing her of the necessary paperwork she would receive, the severance details, the protocols she needed to follow. But Miranda barely heard them. Her mind was spinning. Minutes later, she found herself outside the building, standing in the cold morning air. She had never felt so small. The next few days passed in a haze. She avoided calls from friends and family, ignored the sympathetic messages from co-workers who had heard what happened. The silence of her apartment felt suffocating. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to go outside. Then, one evening, as she mindlessly flipped through channels, she stumbled upon a news segment about workplace discrimination, and there on the screen was Ava Carter. She was poised, articulate, speaking about systemic change and corporate accountability. She wasn't angry or vengeful. She wasn't gloating about Miranda's downfall. She was focused on something bigger than herself. And for the first time Miranda truly saw her. Not as the passenger she had humiliated, not as the woman who had cost her everything, but as someone who had every right to demand better. The realization hit her with crushing force. She had been so focused on her own suffering, on the consequences she was facing, that she had never stopped to think about the person she had wronged. For the first time since it happened, Miranda felt something different from fear or resentment. She felt regret, not just for losing her job, but for failing to be better. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change that. Ava's rise. From passenger to powerhouse Ava. Carter had never been the kind of person to seek attention. She had built her career on quiet strength, careful strategy, and an unshakable belief in her own worth. She knew the world didn't always make room for women like her, black, brilliant, unapologetically ambitious, but she had spent her entire life refusing to wait for permission. That day on the plane, when a flight attendant had looked at her and decided she didn't belong in first class, had been a stark reminder of the battles she had been fighting her whole life. It wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't even just about her. It was about something much bigger, something woven into the fabric of society. An assumption, a quiet prejudice, a belief that some people naturally belonged in places of privilege, while others had to constantly prove themselves worthy of being there. But if there was one thing Ava Carter refused to do, it was to let injustice go unanswered. The moment she was forced out of her seat, she knew what she had to do. She didn't react with anger, didn't raise her voice or make a scene, though every fiber of her being had screamed in protest. Instead, she sat calmly in the economy seat she had been reassigned to, pulled out her phone, and set the wheels in motion. She had spent years cultivating relationships, building a network of powerful allies, and ensuring that when she spoke, people listened. And now, as she typed out a message and pressed send, she knew she had just set off a chain reaction that would be impossible to stop. By the time the flight landed, the executive team of the airline already knew what had happened. Calls had been made, reports had been filed, and Ava had the full weight of the company's leadership waiting for her when she stepped off the plane. She didn't have to demand justice. It was already being delivered. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. The airline, desperate to control the damage, released a public statement acknowledging the incident and promising a full internal investigation. But Ava knew how corporations worked. She knew that statements meant nothing without action, so she made sure there was action. She didn't want a mere apology. She wanted systemic change. She wanted policies rewritten, training programs implemented, and accountability enforced. She wasn't interested in punishing one flight attendant. She wanted to dismantle the very culture that had made Miranda Scott feel justified in what she had done. And Ava wasn't just any passenger. She was a board member, a major shareholder, a woman who had spent years ensuring that her voice had power. When she walked into the airline's corporate headquarters for a meeting with the CEO, she wasn't there to negotiate. She was there to dictate terms. The airline's leadership sat across from her, their expressions carefully neutral, but she could see the unease behind their eyes. They knew they had mishandled this. They knew they had underestimated her. She laid out her demands clearly and without hesitation. A full-scale review of training protocols, a commitment to mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all employees, a new internal reporting system that allowed passengers and staff to flag discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation, a complete restructuring of the airline's customer service policies to ensure no passenger would ever have to endure what she had endured. And she made it clear that if these changes weren't implemented, she would take her story further. She had the press on her side, she had public opinion, and more importantly, she had leverage. The CEO nodded, agreeing to her terms, but Ava knew better than to take promises at face value. She demanded timelines, progress reports, and a direct line of communication with the team responsible for enacting these changes. She wasn't here to simply make noise. She was here to make sure something real came of this. And then something unexpected happened. Other airlines took notice. Executives from competing companies reached out, not just to offer their apologies, but to ask for guidance, They wanted to know what they could do to ensure their own organizations didn't make the same mistakes. Ava saw an opportunity. She could have left it at that. She could have walked away, satisfied that she had made a difference in one airline. But that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about a single incident. This was about an industry-wide problem. So she expanded her reach. She began consulting with other airlines, helping them implement policies that prioritized equity and accountability. She spoke at industry conferences, met with policymakers, and used her influence to push for federal regulations that would enforce anti-discrimination measures across all major airlines. She became a force to be reckoned with, and people were paying attention. News outlets covered her story, not just as a case of injustice, but as an example of what it looked like when power was wielded with purpose. She wasn't just a passenger who had been wronged. She was a leader, a strategist, and a catalyst for change. In interviews, she was poised, articulate, and unwavering. "What happened to me was unacceptable," she told one reporter. "But the truth is, this happens every day to people who don't have the same platform or resources that I do. My goal isn't just to fix what happened to me, it's to make sure this stops happening to anyone." Her words resonated. She started receiving messages from people who had faced similar discrimination, thanking her for speaking up. Flight attendants who had witnessed injustices but had been too afraid to report them reached out, sharing their own experiences. People across industries saw themselves in her story, and they began to demand better from their own workplaces. Ava hadn't just changed one airline. She had sparked something bigger, and yet, through it all, she remained grounded. She wasn't interested in fame. She wasn't interested in personal glory. She was interested in results. She continued her work quietly but relentlessly, ensuring that every commitment made by the airline was followed through. She built initiatives that supported diversity in leadership, pushing for more representation in corporate decision-making spaces. She mentored young professionals, encouraging them to claim their rightful place at the table instead of waiting to be invited. She never forgot where she had started, and she never lost sight of where she was going. A year after the flight that had changed everything, Ava found herself boarding another plane. As she approached the gate, she noticed something different. The staff greeted passengers warmly, without judgment. A young black woman in a sharp business suit stepped into the first-class cabin ahead of her, taking her seat with confidence. And no one batted an eye. Ava smiled to herself. Change was happening. It wasn't just about one moment of injustice. It was about the movement that followed. She took her seat, pulled out her notebook, and wrote down a single thought. Power isn't just about what you have, it's about how you use it. And Ava Carter had used hers well. The legacy of change. A new era in aviation. A year had passed since the flight that changed everything. What began as an act of quiet humiliation had turned into a movement that rippled through an entire industry. Ava Carter had not only fought for justice, she had redefined what justice meant. It was no longer just about one woman standing up for herself. It was about creating a legacy that ensured no one else would have to fight the same battle. In the months following her ordeal, Ava had worked tirelessly to hold the airline accountable. She hadn't just demanded an apology, she had demanded change, and she had made sure it happened. Policies had been rewritten, training programs had been overhauled, and most importantly, a cultural shift had begun. But the true mark of change wasn't in corporate statements or press releases. It was in the way people behaved when they thought no one was watching. One afternoon, Ava sat in an airport lounge, waiting for yet another flight. She sipped her tea and observed the world around her. A young black woman approached the counter, inquiring about an upgrade. The gate agent, a middle-aged white man, smiled warmly and checked her status without hesitation. When he saw she was eligible, he handed her a new boarding pass with a simple "Enjoy your flight." No condescension, no skepticism, just professionalism. Ava let out a quiet breath. This was what real progress looked like. Not grand gestures, not hollow promises, but the everyday moments where fairness replaced bias, where dignity was given freely instead of being something that had to be earned. Still, she knew the fight wasn't over. Discrimination wasn't something that disappeared overnight. It was embedded in systems, in unconscious biases, in the subtle ways people were treated differently without anyone even realizing it. One victory didn't erase centuries of inequality, but it was a start, and Ava Carter had never been one to stop at good enough. She had expanded her efforts far beyond the airline that had wronged her. Other companies had reached out, eager to learn from her work. She had helped shape new industry standards, consulting with major corporations on how to root out discrimination, not just in customer service, but in hiring, promotions, and leadership. Her story had sparked discussions in boardrooms and classrooms alike. Universities invited her to speak about systemic bias and corporate accountability. Aspiring professionals, especially women of color, looked to her as a beacon of strength, proof that they didn't have to shrink themselves to succeed. But even as her influence grew, Ava remained focused on the bigger picture. Change wasn't about one person. It was about shifting mindsets, about making equity the default rather than the exception. She had always known that real power didn't come from titles or wealth. It came from using your voice, from refusing to accept the status quo, from ensuring that when doors opened for you, they stayed open for those who came after. One of the biggest victories came when the airline that had once tried to remove her from first class announced a groundbreaking initiative, a leadership development program designed to advance diversity within the aviation industry. It was a direct result of Ava's push for systemic change. She had insisted that representation wasn't just about hiring, it was about creating pathways for people of all backgrounds to rise to decision-making positions. And now, that vision was becoming reality. On the day of the program's launch, Ava was invited to speak at the airline's headquarters. Standing in front of a packed audience of executives, employees, and future leaders, she took a moment to reflect on how far things had come. "I didn't set out to change an industry," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I simply refused to be treated as if I didn't belong. But what I learned is that when you take a stand, when you demand better, not just for yourself but for others, people listen. Change isn't a single moment. It's the result of countless moments, of people making the choice every day to do better." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Ava wasn't interested in praise. She was interested in progress. She knew that for every person in that room who supported her vision, there were others who resisted it. There were still those who saw diversity initiatives as unnecessary, who believed that bias wasn't a real problem, who thought that stories like hers were isolated incidents rather than evidence of a deeper issue. But she also knew that change had a way of outlasting its opposition. As she left the stage, she was approached by a woman in a navy blue flight attendant's uniform. The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly. I've been in this industry for years, and I've seen things that, well, things that shouldn't happen. And I've always been afraid to speak up. But after what you did, after what you fought for, I don't feel as afraid anymore. Ava felt a lump rise in her throat. This was why she had fought so hard, not for headlines, not for personal gain, but for the people who had been silently enduring what she refused to accept. She reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. "Keep speaking up," she said. "You have more power than you think." The woman nodded, her eyes shining with gratitude. Ava knew there would always be more work to do. She knew that the fight for justice and equity was never truly over. But she also knew that the world had changed, not because of her alone, but because of everyone who had been inspired to demand better. And so, as she boarded her flight that evening, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not just for herself, but for the future. A new era had begun, and this time, everyone belonged. Ava Carter's story was never just about a single moment of discrimination. It was about a woman who refused to let injustice define her. It was about the quiet strength that builds into something unstoppable, about a single voice that becomes a movement. What began as a humiliating experience on a flight became a turning point in an entire industry. Ava didn't just fight for herself. She fought for the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, and treated as if they didn't belong. Looking back, Ava had every reason to let the moment pass, to simply accept the mistreatment and move on. Many would have. After all, she had booked her first-class ticket fair and square. She had nothing to prove to anyone. But the moment she was asked to leave her seat, something deeper than pride took over. It was the weight of history, the knowledge that black women, despite their achievements, despite their resilience, were still being questioned, still being underestimated. She knew that her battle was not just about reclaiming her seat. It was about reclaiming dignity, about refusing to let unconscious bias dictate who got to be comfortable, who got to feel like they belonged. The moment Miranda Scott, the flight attendant, made her decision to move Ava, she believed she was acting with authority. She thought she had the power, but she had underestimated the wrong passenger. Ava was not just another traveler. She was a woman of quiet but unshakable power, a woman who understood that true strength doesn't come from reacting with rage, but from responding. With strategy, she played the long game. She made the right calls, reached the right people, and ensured that the injustice she faced would not go unanswered. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. She didn't need to humiliate Miranda or destroy her career. Instead, she held up a mirror to the system that had allowed this behavior to persist. She forced an entire corporation to confront the biases they had overlooked for far too long, and as the consequences unraveled, it became clear that Miranda was not just dealing with an ordinary passenger. She was dealing with a woman who knew her worth and was willing to fight for it, not with anger but with precision, with intelligence, with the power that comes from knowing you are right. Ava's battle wasn't about proving herself. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to fight the same fight. The airline didn't just apologize, they restructured. They changed policies. They implemented training. They created programs that would make sure their employees recognized and confronted their own biases before they ever had the chance to act on them. This was real power. Not just winning in the moment, but changing the system for the future. The lesson from Ava's journey is one that applies far beyond an airplane seat. First, Never underestimate the power of knowing your worth. Ava never wavered in her belief that she belonged where she was. She didn't doubt herself because someone else questioned her. Too often, we internalize the doubt that others place upon us. We second-guess our right to be in the room, to sit at the table, to claim the opportunities we've earned. Ava's story reminds us that belonging is not something given. It is something we must claim for ourselves, no matter who tries to push us aside. Second, justice is not about revenge. It's about accountability. Ava could have let her emotions control her, but she didn't. She chose to fight in a way that created lasting change. In our own lives, we will face injustices, large and small. The question is not just how we react, but how we use those moments to create something better, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. Third, change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with a single act of courage. Ava didn't know that standing up for herself would lead to a transformation within the airline industry. She only knew that what had happened to her was wrong, and she refused to let it slide. That's how change begins, with one person, one action, one moment of saying, "This isn't right and I won't accept it." Finally, power is not about position, it's about influence. Ava was just a passenger. She had no official title, no authority within the airline. But she understood that true power comes from knowledge, from connections, from refusing to be silenced. She leveraged her resources, her voice and her resilience to make sure she was heard. No matter where you are in life, no matter what title you hold, remember that your power lies in your ability to create impact. So what does this mean for you? Maybe you've been in a situation where you were overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly. Maybe you've been told, directly or indirectly, that you don't belong. Maybe you've been faced with a choice to stay silent or to speak up. Let Ava's story remind you, your voice matters. Your dignity is non-negotiable. And when you stand up for yourself, you pave the way for others to do the same. The world doesn't change because we wait for it to. It changes when ordinary people decide to demand better, when they refuse to move from their rightful place. When they take a moment of injustice and turn it into a movement for something greater. Ava Carter's fight may have started in first class, but its impact reached far beyond that flight. It redefined the rules, it changed the culture, and it proved that the quiet strength of one woman could shake an entire industry. The next time you're faced with a moment of injustice, remember Ava's story. Remember that you don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to be aggressive to demand respect. You just have to know your worth, hold your ground, and refuse to accept anything less than what you deserve. If you believe in stories like this, stories of resilience, justice, and real change, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to bring powerful stories that inspire, educate, and challenge the status quo. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let's keep this conversation going, because change starts with all of us. And together we can make sure that no one is ever made to feel like they don't belong. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.